Hello, mate. How you doing?
We're back.
We're
I'm good.
back. It's not been long. Do you know what? I really, really like our intro outro. Every time I watch it, it does give me the energy and it makes me ready for it. Maybe it's all the synapses connecting and with all the sort of imagery that sits behind that, or maybe it just sounds cool. I don't know what it is,
It
but
does sound cool, and it punches you. It punches in, and it just kind of gets you going.
I'm here for it, man. I'm here for it. We're on opposite sides now, but I'm not going to let that fluster me. I'm still just that way. So it is actually like it's going the way that I expect it to go. But yeah, you got it there. You got it. How you doing, my friend?
Good. As you can see, I'm wearing 3 layers today because the temperature's just dropped right down. I mean, this is summer in Scotland. It's about 12 degrees.
This is the life, huh? This is the life. I know yesterday was beautiful. The sun was out, and I think we reached a balmy like 19 or 20 degrees yesterday. But today it's a bit cloudy, and I'm more worried about tomorrow. Right, tomorrow if it rains, I've got football coaching that I'm taking on an outdoor grass park. So things need to hold out until all of that happens.
Yeah. Oh well.
But it's important stuff. I've got 6 kids rattling around in the background as well. So hopefully one of them doesn't just pop their head in. Do you remember that Sky News moment during COVID where the guy's kids just walked in the middle of the whole thing? So yeah,
exactly.
Maybe it won't be that. Maybe it will. Who knows? But
I would spice things up, but I don't think we need to spice up today because
keep it interesting. Keep it interesting.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'm glad you are in a good mood and you are in a good temperature because the temperature of the conversation is about to rise very, very quickly. That was a tenuous link. And that's all I got though on a Tuesday. So there you go. I'm excited about today. Yeah. How about you?
I absolutely am. Yes. I mean, I've got a lot to ask this guest. Do you want to introduce him now and bring him on?
Sure. Well, super brief intro. Our guest today is Christopher Chin of The Hidden Speaker, and let's just bring him on just now so that he is aware of everything that's happening. You can see and hear us, Chris, right?
Yes, I can.
Tech check that we need here. Fantastic to have you along, my friend. And I've just noticed that you and George are both in checked shirts, so I'm feeling the odd one out already. So. How are things with you? We're in different time zones, but in the same place. So
yes, things are good. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, you're very welcome. And guys, I think it's fair to say this has been a while in the making, right? We've had 3 or 4 attempts to now get this off the ground as well. But Chris, you've been a guest that we've been trying to track down for quite some time now, so it's fantastic to have you on.
Very excited.
Fellow data and visualization professional, but with a bit of a different message from things that we've talked about so far in the series, George, right? Because what have we covered so far? We've covered a lot of AI. We've covered governance.
Yep. And product.
Product specifically. So it's time for something a little bit softer, if you'll pardon the pun. And I think that's where you come in, Chris. And the art of soft skills in the data industry, right? How do we transition from becoming these code monkeys that know how to, we know how to work hard and we know how to build things? How do we transition into these consultants that can help much more throughout a company in terms of giving the right messages and talking about data in the right way? But before we get into all of that, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, Chris? We'd love to hear a little bit more about you before we start diving into some of the topics that we have.
Yeah, sure thing, Brian. I spent the majority of my career in data, doing the dashboarding, doing the analyzing and reporting, data visualizationizing, if you will. But what I realized was the most important skill set I needed to develop as a data professional was communication skills. Because early on, when I didn't work on those skills, I was passed over for promotional opportunities. I didn't get the respect that I wanted in my organization. The products I created ended up not being used. And I said, it's really communication, good communication between data teams and the business that sets you up for success and makes sure that your work has the impact that it should. So I started my organization, The Hidden Speaker, to help companies, to help individuals with developing these critical soft skills so that they can have impact with their work.
Impact. That's a good word to start this off, right? And I think most of us can show some kind of empathy with the statement that you made there in terms of communication and starting off in a place and ending up in another place. It's a hard and long journey, right, to make that happen. It's not something that that just happens. And I speak from my own personal experience here. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that earlier part of that journey that you've come from in terms of, you know, moving from technical to consultancy? What were some of the biggest things that you were finding were being barriers from moving up that ladder to start with?
When I was transitioning into data, I came from a non-technical background. I came from a field of music composition, completely different, liberal arts, all that artistic stuff. And I faced the hurdle of trying to convince hiring managers that I was worthy of this job, that I could do the work they expected of people with formal degrees and boot camp training. I was entirely self-taught. So the biggest hurdle was demonstrating my competence through my portfolio of a bunch of data visualization projects. And then when I eventually got my first job, proving on the job that I could be as good as the other people on the team who had this prior technical background. That was the biggest hurdle. Then I found that despite all the hard skills I had worked to develop, SQL, Tableau, Power BI, Excel, all those things, that I still was missing something, and that was the communication component, because no matter how good the work I did was, it wouldn't have that impact unless I communicated about it properly.
So I wonder, and I'll let George jump in after this, but in terms of some of those common pitfalls that you come across when you are maybe more technical than less consultancy to start with, what were like the biggest things that you came across in the earlier part of your career?
For many of my early clients that I worked with starting last year, helping them with their public speaking communication skills, one thing I noticed is us as technically minded professionals tend to focus on the details, this granular stuff at the bottom. We really like solutioning, figuring things out. However, the people we speak to have the complete opposite end of the spectrum as their priority, which is the big picture, the strategic high level 10,000-foot view. Why does this matter to the business? How can this make everybody more money? And what I helped a lot of people do, especially early on in my consultancy and coaching journey, was change the mindset from the granular level up to the big picture level. See the connection between all the things you're doing, how that connects to the people that you're speaking to.
That's interesting. George, for you?
Yeah, so I think I've had quite a bit of experience of this in my time. And I think, like you, Christopher, I've, well, possibly not like you, but I learned the hard way, I think, how to communicate. But what I tuned into was, first of all, senior management. They're busy with all sorts of things. There's many things going on in their mind. And what I heard time and time again is senior management just coming up with little sound bites that they would repeat over and over and over again. I was with one organization that were transitioning. They held a lot of debt, so they were transitioning to become capital light. They wanted to get rid of the debt, so they were selling portfolios, etc. And that's all we heard. It was capital light. We're transitioning to becoming capital light. So that was the two things. I was with Sky, one of Rupert Murdoch's businesses in the UK. We have a TV station called Sky, and for them it was all about living the vision. We didn't know what the vision was, but we all had to live it. And I think it was hearing that over and over again. I thought these guys just they want something that is catchy and quick and that they can identify with. And then if you can tune into that and then almost tilt your message or what you're trying to give over to them so that it docks in with what they're saying and what they believe their mission critical points are, then that seems to work. But that means you're almost having to change your tune a little bit and your narrative to fit in with the senior management. Mm-hmm. Have you had that experience before, Christopher? Are you listening to what they're saying before you come up with what you're saying?
I would add that this topic is what I love, because what you spoke to is how effective communication is very similar to music. And I had a prior background in music composition. What you said is a lot of these senior managers and leaders, they change their communication so it's repetitive and it's memorable. So it's like a catchy tune that you hear and get stuck in your mind. What I feel is that the more effective your communication becomes, the more you push it in that direction, the more musical it also becomes. The shorter and more concise it becomes if you're a leader, the catchier it becomes, and you get to the point really quickly. So you take out all the noise and you bring out all the signal. That's what good music is all about. And that's also what good communication is all about. To your second point about tailoring your communication after you've heard the message, that is key. What I see too often in our industry is a lot of people talking at each other about the things they believe. So person A says, I believe this. Person B says, no, I believe this. And then you just keep talking in different directions about what you separately believe. But what should happen more so is listening. So once you've heard someone, really take the time to genuinely understand what they're saying and then add on to it. Try and build something together instead of talking in different directions.
All right. That's powerful. That is that's good advice. But I don't know how easy it is. I mean, is this something that you teach then? Can people learn this so that they can then communicate at all levels? Because I can tell you, when I was, I mean, I'm 50 now, so I've been around the block for 30 years now, and talking about data in one way or another for 30 years. But I can remember how damn nervous I was at speaking to anybody, even one level above me, back then. You know, how do you teach this, and how do people learn this?
I was working with a client recently on this idea of how do you communicate effectively, especially with executives and senior managers who are very short on time, want you to get to the point. And this client was struggling with concise communication. When they spoke, they were trying to process their thoughts at the same time, figure out what they were trying to say, included so much detail that they knew. And what I help them do is structure their communication, just like the technical skills we know, where there are functions in SQL and there are stored procedures. There are the same building blocks in communication. They just aren't taught that way. So what I like doing is making communication taught just like a technical skill that we know. Here are some frameworks you can use to be concise. For example, if you want to get a point across, you can use the structure point, reason, example, point. You say your point first, then you give a reason for that point, an example to back up the reason, and then finally restate your point again. So if I were giving you some kind of argument, I could say, effective communication is like music. The reason is because music has repetition and memorability, just like good communication does. Here's an example of that. I can share an example of that. And then I restate the point at the end. Therefore, if you want to be an effective communicator, it helps to study what good music sounds like so you can make your speech sound more like that.
That's almost, in the consulting world, that's almost the McKinsey style of presentation, where they would at the front, they'll give you the message. This is the information you need to know. As in, your business is burning through an additional 20 million a year that you could save. That's it. So I could save 20 million. Then they go into the justification. So it's almost, what's the hook? Get them hooked, and then the justification. Exactly. But you're right about the simple message.
I was chatting with a client just yesterday about this exact thing. They were working on a presentation, and the intro is often the hardest part. You look at the blank page and you say, oh, how do I start this thing? And how they started it originally was talking about all the details and what they did and how they got there. And I said, imagine your audience contains a lot of bored 5-year-old children. How are you going to get them interested in what you have to say? Short attention spans. So we focused on what is the problem? What is the pain? What is the challenge? If you say that, then people start listening.
I think that's incredibly interesting. And I recall a recent presentation. Loosely, it was a presentation, right? And I was starting it off really dry. Like I started to go into here's me, here's who I am. And then I was like, not during the presentation itself, but as I was prepping for it, I was like, this isn't going to work with this audience, right? This is not going to work. And all I can really remember about the presentation is that I pivoted to some kind of Lord of the Rings type of introduction with how would Boromir or Sean Bean refer to the audience if they were talking about this problem. And it was amazing. I don't mean it was amazing from the content I created. I just mean like seeing even one face in the audience go, you know what, that resonates with me because you made it personal and you made the effort to make it personal. And I think that's just a critical thing when it comes to presentation, right? Your personalization needs to show through much more than the fact that you used an AI tool to build your presentation nowadays, for example, right? So what are your thoughts on that, Chris, in terms of personalization when it comes to presenting back to your audience?
I have two thoughts on that. One is something that we often forget about in data is no one will care about the data unless you connect it to people again. You find the humanity behind the data. So you could have numbers that show really important things, but unless you say how that impacts people, your company, your organization, your team, your manager, your boss, they're not going to care about it. And the second thing is relating it to your audience is one of the most important things to do in any presentation. We can tell stories to each other, but the stories we remember most are when we can relate to the characters in the story. So if they experience pains that we currently experience, we can say, oh, I see myself in that person's shoes. Then we see that character undergo a journey, solve that problem. Now we know how to solve it for our own lives. That's the power of good storytelling. So I highly recommend for anyone starting any presentation, first take the time to know who your audience is, how your material can best serve them.
That's a great tip, actually, and that segues us quite nicely into. I'd like to switch gears for a minute, Chris, actually. And you talked about, you've mentioned visualization and you've mentioned data storytelling, right? Already during this conversation, it's only taken us like 10 minutes to get there, right? And I think sometimes there's a lot of confusion between the two. So I thought what we could do is just something a little bit fun just now. We could switch over and have a look at maybe some of the differences between visualization and data storytelling, and maybe something that is close to all our hearts right now. It's election time, right, in the UK. So we talked about this in our last show, George. We were just on the cusp of getting a new government. That has now happened, and they're in post. But obviously in the States, there's a lot happening on the election front as well. So I thought what I would do, and we're just going to give this a little try here. Let's see if we can switch scenes here. So I would just like us to have a little chat about some of these examples that we've pulled together, Chris, between us, right? So a visualization says a lot of things, right? But a story tells a lot more and a lot less. So I just want us to have a little chat through this. So this is the first example that I picked, right? And it just happened to be a pie chart. So I just want to open the floor to you for a minute about what you think about this visualization. And George and I can chime in. We've got a couple more to go through, but I just thought it'd be nice to dissect this a little bit and understand the differences between visualization and storytelling.
Sure thing. My first thought, and it's the thing I do for any visualization I see for the first time, is I say, okay, within 5 seconds, let me try and understand what it's trying to say to me. I cannot understand that here. And I see that the title you included is just for the purposes of this discussion. I'm curious to know if it had a title to begin with, because the title would then clue me in. What is it trying to say? Is it trying to say most people are conservative and very few people are part of the SNP party? I don't know what that message is. The use of color here is very random and unpurposeful. I don't know where my eye should look first. There's blues and greens and yellows and reds. I don't know what's the most important part to pay attention to. And I would add that pie charts aren't always bad, because pie charts are fantastic for showing part to whole relationships. But where it goes wrong is if you have so many categories, let's say more than 3, more than 5, then it becomes this startling mess of noise on the page, and I can't see things very clearly. Look at the 3%, 2%, 1% at the top. I can barely see them because the font is so small and they're all stuck up next to each other. So my recommendation for this kind of visual would be first figure out what your message is. Then use color purposefully to highlight what the most important part is. So if conservatives, if that slice is the most important one, make that blue, make everything else a lighter shade like gray, so it falls into the background.
Yeah.
George, anything to add from that? I think you've pretty much nailed everything, Chris, but I'll let George speak, and then I can tell you a little bit more about this chart and where it's from and what it's about. So
I think a narration is always great. If this was part of a dashboard, then it's already failed. I think, as you said, Christopher, if there's a narration around this, and if you've got, if you're sort of standing up in front of an audience talking about something, and your point is is a single point with this chart, and it is to say that Conservatives hold 33% of the vote, then okay, you're probably going to get it across. But as you said, you'd have to make everything else a lot grayer. The narration will be key here, but I agree. There's just not enough information in here. There's a couple of colors that are very similar. I have difficulties with reds and greens, and also the the 3%, 2%, and 1%, they're not quite aligned properly. Yeah, it's difficult, and you're right. Within 5 seconds, I've kind of given up, and I'm looking elsewhere and saying, what is this telling me? Is there anywhere else I could read on this page that will help me understand this chart? If not, I'm moving.
I think what you've both mentioned there has covered almost everything. So I'll just mention one more thing. First of all, the other segment is not the bottom end of the chart. The other segment is 4%, and it's sandwiched in between real segments of data, which to me just blows my mind how the other segment can be categorized like that. But I think we can understand, right, that we don't know the topic of this chart just by looking at it. We're guessing, right? We're guessing, and things look the same in terms of colors. But I'll tell you a little bit more about this chart also for the people who are listening and can't see it. This is a pie chart that has about 8-9 segments, all of which are pretty similar, and some of which are pretty similar in terms of size. But the content of this chart is actually, this poll was taken 3 months before the general election in the UK from a farmer's perspective, and that's the title of the chart here. How would you vote in the general election if you were a farmer, right? So there's not even any title for this chart. So I think we can all agree, without digging into this much further, I think everyone can see that this is a pretty bad example of visualization. And this is another good example of where visualization is not the answer to everything, right? A chart on its own does not tell a story.
Yeah.
It's not accompanied with the right narrative. So to put a positive spin on that, let's move on a little bit to something that I think is a little better in terms of the way that it's describing what's happening.
Yeah.
And Chris, do you want to get us kicked off on this one?
Was that me that you?
Yeah, sorry. Chris,
yeah.
Do you want to kick us off on
no
this
worries.
one? Let us know what you think.
Yeah, this one, I like the styling of this a bit more. There was more care taken to arrange all the elements from the title, which is clear. Labour secures landslide victory in UK election, subtitle, and then all the pieces of the legend. I like the creativity here as well. What I often see in data visuals is they try to be creative just for the sake of the startle effect. Oh, this is shiny, let people pay attention to it. But here it's purposefully done. You can see that it's arranged similar to how people would sit in an actual room, this kind of seating chart format. And you can see the proportions. Most people are the Labour Party, it looks like, then Conservative, then Liberal Democrats. So it mirrors that. And then people can, while it's a new chart, understand what it's trying to say. So I do like this chart better. I will say that it becomes a little more difficult to understand when you get to the smaller proportions. So the yellows and purples and pinks and all that at the bottom right, it's hard to differentiate that. But for the general scheme of things, much better than the previous chart.
George?
Yeah.
Your go?
Yeah, and so this almost falls into the infographic category for me, but I think it does it well. I mean, each dot within the semicircle there represents a seat in the UK Parliament, and so very quickly you can see the red seats won it, and then you can look over on the right and say it's Labour. If you want, and so that comes up within the first 1 or 2 seconds of looking at it. But then you look at the legend there, and then you can see, okay, the Reds are Labour, fantastic. And then there's even more information, an additional 211. I wonder if everybody would get this, but if you live in the UK, you probably know enough about our voting system to realize that they won an additional 211 seats based on their previous vote. I think this brings in a lot of information. You can drill down just visually where you need to, and it says everything it needs to without having to ask any questions or rely on a narration.
I completely agree with everything that you both said, and the only thing I will add to that is that the thing I like most about this chart is that it has, or this infographic, is that it has context. So I immediately know when I look at it that 326 is the line that I need to pass to be the dominant party, right? So that metric is in there, and I can immediately tell that someone has delivered that metric, and I can already tell that there's a winner. I take Chris's point about just the cluster of seats at the end. But I suppose from a UK perspective, George, this is quite representative of how Parliament is really. You're squashed into one side of a building, get a circular format, and you get, if you are the losing parties, you get the seats that are at the end of that. So in some ways, it's quite indicative of how, and I think that's why the context of a chart and the choice of a chart is so important, because it's easy to say, well, the semicircle makes it easier to read, but when you think about the shape being the same shape as Parliament benches, it gives it real context and lets you make that mind map between it. So much better, I would say. I think we all agree that that's maybe an 8 or 9 out of 10, that one, in terms of giving us the info that we need. So we've got one more here that we'll cover. And I'm going to let George lead on this one, mate. Why don't you kick this one off?
So this one was actually taken from the 2012 election, but it was a narration by Jeremy Vine, who's one of the UK sort of political pundits in the over here. And this was he did this within the last 2 or 3 weeks, and he was talking about the sort of evolution of political races in the US. So I think that's Obama versus Rooney. Is that Mitt Rooney?
It's Mitt Romney, isn't it? Yeah,
Romney. That's right. Yeah. Romney, not Rooney. And what we have here is a 3D chart showing. Well, there's a little bit of context there at the back. The electoral college votes. For me, well, actually, I'm going to stop there. And pass it over to Christopher to get your perspective on it. But generally, this was obviously narrated. Jeremy Vine was sort of walking around a green screen with charts popping up in front of him as he narrated that to a TV audience. Christopher, what do you think when you see it?
My instant thought is not necessary to make this 3D. And there are several reasons for that. One is, if I'm looking at it from this angle, I can't see all the states. Mm-hmm. I can only see the bottom ones. I can't really see the ones in the back. That's the problem with a lot of 3D. If I were to look at it from the top, like an aerial view down, I still could not see the heights of everything. That would be obscured for me. So that angle wouldn't be good either. 3D in general, I don't recommend its use unless you have 3D data, to speak of like topographical data, showing the mountains and how high they are. For this, I see a lot more useful visualizations that are just 2D. So you have the plain old map, and then you just color in the states that are red versus blue. That's a very common thing that most people will connect with instantly. If the purpose was to just compare what is the highest states in terms of the electoral college votes, maybe we don't even need a map. If the purpose is comparison, if that's the point he's trying to make in his narration, maybe we just need a bar chart to show top 5 states for votes, the bottom 5 for votes. So what I caution is, just because you have geographical data doesn't mean you should visualize it in a map.
Thank you, Brian.
Look, I agree. I feel like this is Minority Report, right? I feel like someone is walking in amongst this scene and it's growing and sinking at the same time, and the numbers are flashing up and then going away. Maybe a bit like Google VR or Google Goggles or whatever it was that put augmented reality in front of you for a little while. Those almost took off. But in general, like, I was thinking about this before, and I generally hate it. And I hate it because I can't actually deduce anything at all from this. Without the backdrop, I wouldn't know even what it's about. I don't. And you, George, you mentioned the thickness of the bars. I like the color coding, but the thickness of the height of the bars, it's just like, if you're going to do that, you may as well just have a scatter plot or something like that defines those metrics in a little bit of a better way. But what I will say in its defense, and then we'll move on from after this, is that sometimes this format does work from a news perspective, right? And I think that's why it's difficult to pigeonhole storytelling and visualization into one paradigm, because probably for the presenter, if the zooming in was at the right times and the numbers showed and the statistics showed, we're only seeing one snapshot of that data. And sometimes you need to see that data living and breathing to make it a true story. So maybe this was a story and we just caught a snapshot of that story at the time where we had a look at this as well.
Yeah, well, I'll just kind of wrap it up, Brian, and say that in general, we're seeing a lot more of these on UK TV, and the the UK general election, on election night, it was full of this. They had a huge green room. Jeremy Vine had a huge green room with charts popping up in front of him, which was, I know, he got a mixed reception. But in this case, he was making a single point. The single point was that the Electoral College votes in California, Texas, and Florida were important because there was the numbers were much bigger. So if you could swing one of these states, it was super important for picking up a lot of the rest of them, because what we can't see, I mean, the north of North America, especially sort of the small states around New England, you can't see that at all. No idea what's going on there. But in this case, he just wanted to make one point that that California, Texas, and Florida counted for a lot of the Electoral College votes. So in this case, fine. But it needed the narration.
Yeah,
right back to the storytelling side of things, doesn't it?
I think that kind of brings us back to life. But it's nice to see these practical examples and critique them, because a lot of people are swayed by what they see in the media. And there's some very famous charts out there from previous elections, that especially the ones that have the 0% axis chopped off, or the ones that say 72% but actually read as 23% is another good one as well. But it's context, right? And I think that's something that you must spend a lot of time in, Chris, is context. Mm-hmm. So data communication is one thing, but how you contextualize that communication must be completely another, because there's ways to deliver a message, right?
Absolutely. Context is one of the most important parts of the story, because context informs me why I should care about this. To our earlier discussion, if you start out with the big shocking point, oh, problem here, or this is what we should do, this is the recommendation I have, we're not there yet. I don't understand why I should buy into that yet. And that's where the context has to come into play. You have to convince the executive or whoever you're talking to that this is the best choice, considering all the other options. So talk about, where did we come from? Where do we want to go? What's the things standing in the way?
So I suppose to bring that into context, if you're trying to explain that problem, so say that I'm someone that's working as a developer or a data analyst, and I'm trying to get my point across, and the way that I would typically do that is I would maybe create some charts. I would maybe put those charts into a presentation and put some bullet points around them. And I'm saying that because I've done it, George has done it. Well, I'm assuming that he's done it as well. And it's not always the right way to go, but a lot of people that I know maybe don't know the right way to go, or to do something different from that. So how do you start to structure your arguments and your framework so that the CXO and the board and those types of people can understand what the message that you're trying to get across? What are some practical things that we can do to apply that?
I was chatting with a client very recently about this exact problem. They were asked by their boss, I want you to create a presentation by end of day today to present. Literally just a few hours to pull something together. So their first thing to do was, okay, I got to create a bunch of charts. I got to put a bunch of text on the slide so I know what I'm saying. And it just created a jumbled mess of a presentation that everybody tuned out from, and it didn't have the impact that it should have. So when I talked to him later about it, I said, okay, let's start from the beginning. What is the first thing you do when you're asked to create a presentation? And I said, don't start with creating slides. Don't start with creating slides. And the reason is, if you start with creating slides, it's kind of like a brain dump, kind of the brainstorming process. You end up with all these things you actually don't need. I told him, what you need to do instead is write the story first. Then, once that's clear, create the slides to support that. And the three parts you need in your story are, what are the problems now? What are the pains? What are the challenges? What should people care about? Because people in this organization will care if there are problems. Then, what is the goal? Where do we want to go from this low point we're starting at? What is our climactic moment, our aha moment where we say, oh, that's what we need to do? And then you end with saying, these are my recommendations for you, so we can get from where we are now to where we want to be. So problems, goals, and then those actions and lessons at the end.
Can you sum that up then as saying what we're actually doing is we're using charts and visualizations to support our message, rather than kind of almost the other way around, where you've got a chart, but you have to have a message around it to almost support the chart?
Absolutely. What I tell all my clients is, You should be able to deliver your presentation without your slides. They should not be your crutch. They should just be highlighting the major points that you deliver. So charts are great. They help you visualize complex information, but can you carry the message and story just by yourself? That's the ultimate test.
And I think this is again another context item, that presenting means a lot of different things, right? So presenting to some people means I have to have a PowerPoint deck that guides me through how I'm going to tell my story, whatever that may be, from start to finish. Whereas for other people, presenting becomes a bit more of a, okay, so how am I going to say this to my audience? Almost like my slides don't exist. And that's a very hard place to get to, because you need reps to get there, right? And I think, do you want to talk about that for a minute, like, Chris, just reps and getting to where you need to be? Because certainly the video I shared from LinkedIn this morning about my presentation from 9 years ago, I'm this juddering mess that my hands are waving all over the place, and I'm just sort of plucking out of the air what I'm going to say next. And I like to think I'm a little better at it now, but it's taken a long time to get there, right? So how important is it to practice what you're doing? And not just for that particular presentation, but just to get those reps in.
It's absolutely essential, because if we remember the time we needed to learn any technical skill, SQL, anything, we needed to put in the reps. We don't instantly know the function to use when we need to find the maximum in the column. We need to practice it. We don't know instantly how to create a stored procedure. We need to practice the structure and the framework. In the same way, we need to practice communication, ideally every day. What I have many of my clients do, to much of their chagrin, is every day I want you to send me a recording of yourself telling me a story, giving me a presentation every single day, just a minute of something. Then you practice that. It becomes infused in your daily routine. You understand it more because you're immersed in it all the time. So even if you have a tight deadline coming up, let's say you're that same client I described before, your boss tells you, end of day, I need you to present this. Get in at least one rehearsal through. So that way you sound a little bit more polished when you deliver the ultimate presentation. Going in cold is never a good idea.
I got one more, and then I'll let George jump in after that. And I've heard us all ironically use this during the actual presentation that we're doing here. Silence is a very important part of presenting. Silence does not mean that you are lost. It can be, you can be, because you are lost, but silence is an extremely important way of just getting your audience to look up and look at you and pay attention to you, because they know something good is coming, right? And this was I have a good friend called Donald Farmer who works in the data industry and used to work at Click and Microsoft. And one of the things that he told me is stop umming and ahhing and just pause instead. So instead of going, just don't say anything, because that's how you hold your audience's attention a lot of the time. So what other tips and tricks have we got in our presentational vocabulary that we can use, Chris, to just get our watchers on side when we're doing these kind of things?
I like to lean more into your tip for pausing. What I like to use as an analogy is music again. When we type something, let's say we're typing a script we want to say for a presentation. Every sentence we have has one space between the period and the capital letter of the next sentence. We only have one space in our writing. But in music, what's beautiful about music is the silence has many spaces. We can have one space, two spaces, three spaces, four spaces, and that's notated in the actual score. We indicate how long we want to pause. Music is beautiful because it has both the notes and the silence in between. So when you speak and when you present, it's important to think, what are the moments I want to lean into to pause? What are those key moments? When I rehearse, let me remember that and just count the number of seconds I want to pause there. Changing up that number of seconds, 1 second for just changing topics, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds for changing to a new theme, a new emotion, really leaning into a heavy moment, a big revelation that you've had. Altering the length and duration of your pause is also a really important trick.
Interesting.
This is not a pause. This is just waiting for George, because I said I would let him go next. So,
oh, thanks, Brian. I think so. This has all been really interesting, and I really like how we're using music and composition just to to help put a color around what we're talking about. I think that's really important. And maybe in the future, I'm going to talk. Not a lot of people know this, but I have a degree in forestry and conservation, and I got into visualization through forestry. There's a really beautiful story about how that all worked, but it's not for today. What I wanted just to mention, and I know we're getting short of time because you've got a hard stop, Christopher, but I think almost implicitly when we've been talking about communicating, we've been talking about, it feels like we've been, how do we communicate a message up? But I think it's important just to say that the message, a lot of people that we work with that listen to us are running teams, be them visualization teams, be them analysis teams, whatever. But I think the message is also just as important for people sort of communicating to their team and communicating to other audiences like that. Is there any way, though, that you would tilt your communication depending on the audience?
Absolutely. I have 2 tips for leaders who want to communicate well. And this is based on scientific studies of when do employees feel their leaders are communicating well? When do employees feel most at home in the organization, most empowered in their work based on communication competence? And the 2 tips that I've uncovered are, 1, you need to be concise and clear in the tasks you specify for your employees. There should be no ambiguity there. They should know what they have to do, what their job responsibilities are. 2 is you need to lean into the relationship building aspect too. So you can't just be barking orders at them. You also need to let them feel they're part of a team that supports them, where they can shine and do their best work. You need to master both the empathy side and also the concise, direct, assertive side. With both of those together, you can be the great leader that can inspire your team to do great work.
Super tip.
I think the one I just want to latch onto, and again, I appreciate we're getting near the end here, Chris, is interactivity as well, right? And you talk about delivering the message in the right way and understanding whether it's coming up or down. But that's a two-way street, right? And presenting is not just me talking at you or you talking at me. It's about us communicating in a way that gives opportunities for us to talk and for it to be a conversation, because a presentation would intimate that I'm just sitting here and talking to you with no right to reply from you as the audience. And we need to make sure that those channels are open, right?
Absolutely. The best presentations that we remember are not monologues, they're dialogues where the presentation feels like a meaningful conversation between everyone in the room.
Fantastic. Well, look, Chris, we know that, again, you've got that hard stop coming in a few minutes. So I just really want to spend a few seconds saying thank you for coming and making the time to fit us in as well. It really is something that is a big privilege for us to have our guests on this show. And it sounds a bit grandiose, but you're giving up your time and you're delivering great messages for our audience as well in terms of communication and the ways that you can sort of mix that up to make it something that's part of your daily life as well. George?
This was a ton of fun.
Yeah. Christopher, thank you so much. There's been some real insight there, and I think some real learning for our listeners, and especially for me. I think that there's some key takeaways there around about message. I think the sort of rhythm and repetition is something that I'll go away with here, because that's important, and I like that. Simple, repeatable, and just the sort of rhythm that's coming out with it. And then I think the other one is just the visualizations are supporting your message. They're not the key thing there. They're supporting your message as well. But Christopher, thank you. Thank you for all the work that you do as well. And I'll be really interested to tune into your TED Talk when it happens in the future. I hope I haven't stolen any thunder there, but
not at all.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much to you both. This was a ton of fun and a wonderful opportunity. So thank you.
You're welcome, Chris. Feel free to drop off. We'll stay on for a few minutes with our audience here, but thank you once again. Good. Appreciate it. All the best. So I will help Chris with that just now. There we go. So I feel like I learned a lot there. And I'm not just saying that either. I think that communication is a heavily overlooked part in our industry, especially as we're expected to move at even faster speeds nowadays with everything that we do. What do you think, Bud?
Who was it that talked about the vocabulary of business? My brain.
I think you might be referring to Jordan Morrow, who was talking about the language of business, potentially. The language of data or the language of business, yes.
Yeah, because I think Christopher brought that full circle, because I've experienced time and again, and actually I find myself, if a monologue is going on for too long, or if there's too much text or too much information to try and soak up, you're just looking for the summary. You're looking for a brief bit, because you know, we've all got busy lives, busy days. A visualization helps with that to get a message across quickly. But if it's complicated, then it's not going to land. And I think us as people that are creating these messages, we have to be cognizant of that and make sure that we're getting a simple message across. And I think Chris's teachings there then are key to doing that.
There's a lot to be said for simplification, I think, when it comes to communication, and not trying to over-egg the egg, as it were, overcook the egg. And that's something. I got my communication all wrong there, but I thought I would just escape out of the analogy, even though you're not letting me do that, which is quite bad of you. But yeah, okay, I'm going to plan my exit route anyway. Look, I think for me, the penny dropped with me a few years ago that often PowerPoint is not the way that you get your message across. It's a supporting device in the way that you being in a room is a supporting device, and that your tone of voice is a supporting device, in terms of the way that you pause is a supporting device as well. And for me, it was a long, hard road, because I went through a lot of very bad presentations that I delivered before I became moderately better at it. And I think that was the other thing that Chris mentioned as well, is just, you have to practice. You just can't become a great communicator by just reading a book about becoming a communicator. You have to read a book, you have to speak to people, you have to apply that, and you have to do it over and over again, even if you don't like doing it. And that paradigm works quite well with a lot of things that we've discussed so far in this season. So
yeah. And I think you're right. It comes down to repetition, and I believe anybody can learn it. Honestly, if we go back to like 30 years ago, when I was doing my first presentations, some of them were complete car crashes. I walked off stage at one point just because I couldn't continue. I just completely froze up. I think anybody can do it, but it just takes time. It takes learning. And some of these key bits of information from Christopher today are going to help. And these ones then keep the message simple. Repeat that simple message. And I really liked his bit about just find some kind of rhythm, some kind of, almost like an art form, isn't it? There's one more that Christopher didn't mention, but I'll give it from my experience, and that is know your subject. If you're talking about something that you know, it's easy. As soon as you're trying to get across something that you haven't researched or you haven't done your homework on, it's going to show.
I would add to that, and I think that is a great one. I would add to that is that creating a presentation 12 minutes before you're due to present almost always ends in disaster, because even though you might know the content of the thing that you're talking about, you don't know the transition of how to talk about that content in a pressurized situation. And it's very, very hard to just pull something together and then to present it fluidly like you haven't pulled it together. So the other thing I would just say is give yourself a chance. Give yourself a chance to be successful, because that last minute just in time thing doesn't often work with presenting. Some very talented people can do it, but give yourself a chance.
Yeah, there's the odd veteran out there that I'm sure can do it, but for most of us mere mortals, it's worthwhile researching.
What I want to just do to close us off here, George, is that we've neglected the chat a little bit, but I see that Restream is doing our thing again, of LinkedIn user. So I'm going to guesstimate at who some of these people are. I haven't looked at the LinkedIn stream yet, so maybe you can do that in the background while I'm just referencing these to work out who these comments are. But I'm pretty sure some of them must be Angelica. because I see a few of them there. Context is queen. We spent quite a bit of time on this topic. And I think that it's super important to make sure you're not just presenting for the sake of it, and the content that's in your presentation matters. Quite often when we present, I think one image does it. One slide, a background image, just gives you all the collateral that you need to be able to talk about it. Having the skills to be able to talk about it is a different kettle of fish, but yeah, context.
Yeah. Context, absolutely.
Next one here, okay? We've got a little bit of a mention about data literacy here, and I actually wanted to ask Chris about this as well, was the link between data literacy and presentation skills, I think, is probably quite a strong one. And I don't mean that from a pure literacy perspective of the person who's presenting. I'm probably talking about the gap between the user who is presenting and the person who's receiving that information. Yeah. Very often those audiences are not on the same literacy level. And I think that's often not compensated for when it comes to presentation. So a technical paradigm will be applied to deliver technical information to a non-technical audience who does not have the literacy to be able to understand what the subject is. And I know we talked about that, but I wanted to actually talk about the physical part of data literacy and what that plays in that role.
You can't assume that you're speaking to a data literate audience, but I think at the same time, you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't be making your charts so complex that that it takes somebody that's gone through a data literacy course or has a degree in Excel to understand what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing I'll just close off on here is the data escape room. So this is something that, again, the rise of the data escape room discuss. I think it's just a wonderful concept to bridge all of the things that we've talked about: communication, data literacy, presentation, the ability to interpret the way that people are behaving during a course of events, be that a presentation or not. So what do you think about that as an idea to just upskill us all in terms of our communication? I think that's a good one.
And it sort of gamifies the whole experience as well, doesn't it? It is a great concept. I think we should be doing more of it. I haven't done enough of it. I think we got our first. I got my first introduction in Lund back in, was it 2022 or was it 2023? Yeah, right. Yeah, one year or another. But yes.
Yeah, you're about right. You're about right. And again, these are all incredibly interesting concepts for us to explore how we could run these types of episodes in the future as well. I'm not saying we could run a live data escape room, but maybe we could take some elements into that, and that would be very interesting episodes to build as well. So
it really would be
something to investigate. Indeed. Something to investigate. Well, gosh, that's my timer is ticking up on 54 minutes here, which is significant. And I think that I've really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed this. And Chris was very easy to talk to, and I like that. He should be, but yes, he definitely was.
Yeah, and we've covered quite a lot this season already. So it's not just been, thankfully, about AI, which is the big thing. We're getting into some of the more soft skills and important bits of working in data, which is what the data mix was all about.
Well, exactly, and I think that diversity of topic is something that we'll always try and hold true to moving forward as well. But as we reach the end of this episode, we already mentioned that holidays are looming, so we probably have a little bit of a gap now before we come back to you while we all go enjoy our hollybobs. There you go.
Yeah, a few weeks, but we've got a couple of ideas.
Yes.
I don't want to say anything in case we can't get the next person that we're thinking about, but I think we will certainly have somebody very interesting to talk more about data when we come back after the summer holidays.
Sounds amazing. So with that, I will grant you a great summer holiday, my friend, and to our audience here, thank you so much for coming and joining us again. You have been watching episode 4 of season 2 of the Data Mix, and we will see you all very soon. Thanks again, people. See you again.
Bye for now.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.